In 1960, South Korea's GDP per capita was roughly equivalent to that of Ghana. Both countries were emerging from the shadow of colonial disruption. Both were largely agrarian. Both were, by most metrics, starting from the same line. Today, South Korea manufactures semiconductors that power the world's most advanced devices. Ghana is still negotiating the terms of its next debt restructuring. The gap between them isn't measured in decades, it's measured in operating systems. The standard explanations, corruption, culture, geography, bad luck, are not wrong exactly. They're just incomplete. They describe symptoms while leaving the underlying code untouched. What actually separates these two trajectories isn't the presence of problems, it's the architecture of the institutions built to manage them. Poverty at scale is rarely a failure. It is often a stable systemic equilibrium. And once you understand the difference, the whole map changes. Start with the paradox that should haunt every development economist: natural resources. Nigeria sits on one of the largest oil reserves on the planet. The Democratic Republic of Congo contains an estimated $24 trillion worth of mineral wealth: coltan, cobalt, diamonds, copper. By conventional logic, these countries should be among the wealthiest on Earth. They are not. And the reason is structural, not accidental. When a state's revenue comes from extracting something out of the ground, the incentive architecture of that state undergoes a fundamental shift. The government no longer needs a productive, educated, economically active population. It only needs a functioning extraction operation, the wells, the mines, the export terminals, and enough security infrastructure to protect them. Citizens stop being assets. They become expenses. The state transforms from a service delivery mechanism into a siphon. Tax revenue, which in most functional economies creates a feedback loop between government and citizen. You, tax productivity, you're accountable to the productive, is replaced by resource rents that flow directly to the center. No accountability required. The population is structurally irrelevant to the revenue model. Economists call this the resource curse. It would be more accurate to call it the extraction trap, because what you're really describing is a government that has been relieved of the need to develop its people. And that relief, over generations, hardens into institutional design. To understand why some countries stay poor, you have to dismantle the school book definition of what a country actually is. We're taught to think of nations as coherent entities with shared interests. Governments that, however imperfect, are trying to build something for their populations. That framing is often false, and it's the most expensive false assumption in global development. The more precise frame comes from economists Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson. The distinction between extractive and inclusive institutions. Inclusive institutions are systems where property rights are enforced, contracts are honored, and a regular person can own the product of their own labor. Courts work, banks lend. An entrepreneur in Lagos or Dhaka can build a business and keep what they build. The system has an interest in expanding the productive base, because the system extracts value from that base through taxation and participation. Extractive institutions are the inverse. Wealth flows from the many to the few through legal and quasi-legal mechanisms. Land dispossession, licensing cartels, opaque procurement, financial systems that serve the connected. In extractive systems, innovation is not just economically irrelevant, it's a political threat. New competitors challenge existing power structures. Disruption, in the original sense of the word, is destabilizing to the people who hold the levers. So, extractive systems suppress it. Not always through violence, often through regulatory capture, bureaucratic friction, and the deliberate non-enforcement of property rights for those outside the circle. The tragedy is that these systems are internally coherent. They're not failing, They're functioning exactly as designed. The design just wasn't built for development. In previous episodes, we examined how money is fundamentally a confidence infrastructure. Credit flows to where trust is institutionally embedded, and dollar dominance persists partly because it represents the deepest pool of that trust globally. Now apply that logic to a country where the courts are unreliable. The banking system serves political relationships rather than creditworthy projects, and property can be seized without recourse. Money is cowardly. Capital moves toward safety, toward enforceability, toward predictable returns in stable legal environments. In a country where the plumbing of trust is broken, the rational choice for any individual with surplus capital is to move it somewhere the plumbing works. This is capital flight, and it operates at every level, from the multinational extracting profits through transfer pricing, booking revenues in low-tax jurisdictions while the actual value is created elsewhere, to the domestic elite parking wealth in Swiss accounts and London real estate. Here's the mechanism that closes the loop. The elites of extractive economies often hold their savings in the strong reserve currencies of wealthy nations: the dollar, the euro, the Swiss franc. In doing so, they export demand for those currencies, reinforcing their global dominance, while simultaneously starving their own domestic economy of liquidity. The capital that could fund local credit markets, small business lending, infrastructure development, it leaves, and the country that generated it receives nothing in return except perhaps the occasional luxury import. The rich countries benefit twice: once from the cheap resources and cheap labor extracted from poor countries, and again from the capital those poor countries' elites deposit into their financial systems. Now, layer on the debt architecture we examined in earlier episodes. Many of the world's poorest nations are not borrowing to invest. They're borrowing to service what they already owe. Sovereign debt, as structured through IMF programs and commercial bond markets, often places developing economies on what can only be described as a maintenance loop. New credit is deployed not to build schools, hospitals, rail networks, or industrial capacity, but to make interest payments on old credit so that access to new credit remains technically available. Development becomes perpetually deferred. The future is always being mortgaged to manage the present, which is itself the product of a mortgaged past. Combine this with what economists call brain drain, and the picture sharpens into something almost mechanically cruel. A country's most valuable long-term asset is not its oil. It's not its mineral deposits. It's the top percentile of its intellectual capital. The engineers, the doctors, the researchers, the institutional architects who could, in theory, rebuild the operating system from within. But if the operating system is extractive, if professional advancement requires political connections, if contracts aren't enforced, if the currency erodes savings faster than labor can accumulate them, then those minds do what capital does. They migrate. They move to inclusive systems that will actually reward what they build. The country loses its doctors to Europe, its engineers to North America, its economists to international institutions. What remains is a permanent deficit not just of capital, but of the human infrastructure required to transform any amount of capital into sustained development. There's a harder question that the development literature tends to approach carefully, if at all. Does the global economic hierarchy actually want these countries to develop? Consider what the current structure requires. Global supply chains depend on low-cost labor. Consumer electronics, fast fashion, agricultural commodities, pharmaceutical raw materials. The price structures that make these goods affordable to wealthy country consumers are premised on the existence of populations who produce them cheaply. A world in which every nation has achieved high wage, high skill, high productivity economic status is a world in which the profit margins embedded in those supply chains compress dramatically. The arbitrage disappears. This is not a conspiracy. It doesn't require anyone in a room somewhere deciding to keep countries poor. It's something more insidious. A set of structural incentives that make poverty in certain places a functional input to prosperity in others. The trade architecture, the intellectual property regime, the agricultural subsidy structures of wealthy nations, the terms on which technology transfer does or doesn't happen, each of these, in isolation, can be defended as rational policy. Together, they constitute an environment in which catching up is genuinely difficult and in which the most powerful actors in the global system have limited financial incentive to change the terms. Development, in the conventional framing, is presented as a destination, a point countries are moving toward at varying speeds, delayed by internal failures of governance or culture or institutional capacity. The more precise framing is a treadmill. The rules of the global economy are not neutral. They were written by the countries that were already ahead, at the moment they were already ahead, and they reflect the interests of those who wrote them. Some countries escape the extractive trap early enough to build inclusive institutions, generate domestic capital, develop technological capacity, and negotiate their integration into the global system from a position of accumulating strength. South Korea was one of them, through a specific historical combination of land reform, state-directed industrial policy, and investment in human capital that was neither accidental nor inevitable. For others, the sequence went differently. The extractive logic took hold first, embedded itself in institutional design, and created a set of actors with a direct interest in its perpetuation. A country stays poor not because it lacks the potential to be rich, but because its architecture is designed to extract, not to build. And once you see the code, you realize that for many, the trap isn't a failure. It's the intended output, visible at last.